Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of FanX Fiction. Today we'll be reading Chapter 2 of That Guy Smoking a Pipe's A Man of Honor.
You can get much farther with a smile, a kind word, and a gun than you can get with a smile and a kind word.
Al Capone. Chapter 2, The First Time I Won a Fight. I took the cab back to Oushi's place after my first night and went back to the apartment. The first thing I wanted to do was collapse onto the mattress and sleep, but I figured that the mission had to come first. I moved the couch and removed the plastic cover for the outlet for the burner scroll, and I dialed the number Osmond gave me. It rang for a minute before picking up.
Mr. Ark?
He greeted. Hey, I said, too tired for any formalities. I was worried for a moment that I was calling at a bad time. I just got off my first shift.
I take it you found a job, then?
He asked me. I did. I'm driving cabs for a woman named Oushi. I'll be working nights, and I just finished helping some girl get away from a jewelry store she robbed. I explained to him. She was some sort of VIP customer for the cab company. I think these VIPs might be other criminals she's acquainted with.
Good work, Mr. Ark,
Osmond told me.
Keep up with the new job and see if any of these special clients of hers let anything slip. In the meantime, I want you to make Oushi and your fellow coworkers understand that you're willing to break some laws for some cash. I imagine being an accomplice to grand larceny on your first night has already helped with that.
It's a good first step, I said, stifling a yawn.
It is, Mr. Ark, but there's still a long way to go. Get some rest and call me next week when there is a development.
He instructed me before hanging up. I collapsed onto my mattress and didn't wake up until the afternoon. When I came back to work, I walked into Oushi's office to tell her what had happened last night after picking up one of her VIPs. I was mainly worried that the cops would have gotten the plates off of my cab and be on the lookout, but it seems that Oushi wasn't worried.
I already heard about what happened,
she explained to me.
That girl texted me once it was done, and I reported my cab stolen,
she said to me, sitting behind her desk with a cigarette burning between her fingers. Won't they find it suspicious that your cab was reported stolen after seeing it fleeing a crime scene? I asked her, as she held her pack of cigarettes out, offering me one. I took the offered smoke, since I figured it'd be polite, and I wanted her to like me for the sake of my mission.
Don't worry about that,
she said, leaning over the desk with her lighter to light my cigarette.
I know some people, and it'll all be cleared up, and nobody will ask questions. How are you doing after all that?
Me? I said after taking my first draw of the smoke and coughing. What about me?
You have a habit of running from the cops?
She asked me.
Or helping thieves?
This is the first time for me, I'm afraid, I told her honestly. She nodded at that and flicked the ash off her cigarette, studying me.
At least tell me you got a tip for your trouble.
I fished the diamond ring out of my pocket and placed it onto her desk for her. She picked it up and examined it.
Pretty,
she said, tossing it back to me.
I'd wait a bit before you try cashing it. It's hot right now. Or give it to your girlfriend.
I pocketed the ring, a little surprised that she was going to let me keep it and not try claiming it for herself. So it's worthless to me now? I asked her.
For now. Wait a year or two, and it won't be so hot. Or get someone to strip it for parts if you're desperate for cash,
she explained. I nodded and took another drag of my cigarette. Is that it? I asked her, wondering just what else there was to talk about if she had everything handled.
Tell me, Jaune,
she asked through a cloud of tobacco smoke.
Are you at all interested in earning a little something on the side?
I shrugged. Of course I was very much interested in getting deeper, but the last thing I wanted to do was look suspicious by acting too eager. I mean, I'm not opposed, but I'm not exactly sure that I want to repeat last night as a regular thing. I know I'm not that lucky. Oh, she chuckled a little.
That's not what I had in mind. You see, Tonin, the guy who owns the shop and the gas station, he's always on the lookout for some car parts for his shop, and some of my employees keep an eye out for the cars he needs. Interested?
You want me to steal cars? I asked her. Oh, she shrugged.
Cars, car parts, but you're not going to be doing any stealing. You're just going to keep an eye out for some of the cars on his list. And if you see any parked while you're out driving, give Tonin a text, and he'll send some boys over to collect it. You get a finder's fee, and I'll collect my cut.
I finished the rest of my cigarette as I pretended to mull it over. I guess I don't want to be pinching pennies. I told her, trying to suppress any guilt I felt over the idea of stealing some people's cars. Hell, that's what insurance is for, right? Oh, she laughed and picked up her scroll and texted me a list of cars for me to be on the lookout for.
That's right.
She said with a wide grin.
Now get to work.
I did just that. Getting back in my cab, I started another night of ferrying around all sorts of late-night types. I checked the list and did exactly as instructed, looking out for any of the cars on the list. I didn't really know much about cars, so I wasn't really anyone who could tell the difference between a Schneiderlach or an Atlarari, or most of the other models listed. So I spent a good deal of my free time on my scroll, searching for the vehicles and getting an eye for them. In the meantime, I was committed to the grind of my job, dealing with plenty of rough, drunk customers. Some were just normal people that needed to get somewhere. Occasionally, I picked up a couple that was going back to their place to hook up. That was always awkward, having a couple loudly making out in the back seat. But here and there, I got to pick up the VIPs. This was exactly what I wanted. They were the people I was hoping to talk to, and maybe get some intel to pass on to Ozpin. Aside from their VIP status when they used the app for a ride, you could always see that these guys were gangsters. They almost always wore suits, usually with red shirts or ties. Occasionally they had some bling on as well. They also always checked the back seat before getting into my cab. Paranoia, as I came to learn, was a necessary part of being a career criminal. These guys were actually my best customers. They never discussed business, so my hopes of passing some hearsay to Ozpin didn't last. But they always had a good story to tell. Some of them were even the guys I talked to about finding a job, and seeing me working for Aoshi changed their attitude pretty quickly. They told me a little about the neighborhood. I learned then that Little Mistral was founded long ago, when the city of Mountain Glen fell to the Grim. Apparently a ton of Mistrali workers immigrated back then to help build the city and found themselves refugees in Vale once it fell. The council stuck them into this ghetto, along with a bunch of faunas and other native Vale refugees. Believe it or not, most of these gangsters never finished school, but they knew their local history enough to pass Ublex class. A lot of them like to talk about the good old days, when He Jiang Sr. and Luca Torchwick formed their families from these displaced masses. But aside from history lessons, these gangsters were always happy to tell me the best places to get a good meal, or point me to the best shops and tell me how not to get ripped off. Since I worked for Aoshi, they were nice to me, and they were certainly a lot more pleasant to drive around than most of my usual customers. But what really made them so great was the way they tipped. For a bunch of wise guys that didn't need to pay for a ride in my cab, they tipped like they wanted to get rid of their money. No one else gave me a diamond ring, but they were pretty generous with the rolls of 20s they carried. By the end of my first week, I wasn't able to fit all those bills into my wallet. I took to hiding the cash behind my fridge in an envelope. As for helping Oshi's partner Tonin steal cars, I finally found my first chance by the end of my first week. I saw a Schneiderlach sitting parked behind a bar that I picked some guy up at. It was last call, so I figured that whoever owned it probably did the sensible thing and got a ride home. It was easy, just one phone call and I was done. The next day when I came in, Oshi had a couple hundred lien for me for finding it. It was nothing compared to what Tonin probably made after chopping it and reselling it, but it was more than I would have made in a single night all by myself. I used to think that most thieves were just opportunists working alone, but I was starting to see just how organized these people were. They were running a network of interconnected hustles and mostly legal businesses. I started spotting more and more cars as I drove around, and all I had to do was make a phone call, and I would make double what I would have gotten in cab fare alone. Whoever said that crime doesn't pay was an idiot who had no idea what they were talking about and should have kept their mouth shut. In a couple weeks, I was able to furnish my crappy little apartment, so it actually felt somewhat like a home. Most of my fellow cab drivers were earning plenty with their side hustles, and like those gangsters that handsomely tipped us, they were practically throwing money away. They'd spend their lien on nice suits and bling, like the wise guys we drove around, so they could look the part. A lot of them were actually like me, trying to move up. They wanted to get real jobs in the family, directly working for Junior or Oushi, and they figured they should dress the part. They also spent their money going to restaurants or nightclubs, or buying their girlfriends expensive gifts. It was madness. These people were bringing home more dough than most people could have working an honest job, and they were practically throwing it away. But these guys had no intention of ever making an honest buck, as I learned over time. They grew up in this neighborhood, barely having enough money for lunch, and watched these guys driving around in nice cars with nice suits. A lot of kids want to grow up to be doctors or huntsmen. Kids in this neighborhood wanted to be gangsters, and that dream was always within reach for them. For a while, this was my life. Driving a bunch of people around, including some gangsters, and occasionally spotting a nice car that Tonin wanted, and making a call for one of his boys to pick up. I had also become quite the night owl, staying up all night and through the early hours of the morning, and my social life was occasionally grabbing breakfast with my coworkers after a long shift before going back and crashing in my tiny little apartment. My reports to Osmond didn't really have anything of particular interest to him. He didn't want to hear anything about cars being stolen, He wanted me to tell him about the dust robberies that were happening across the city, but I honestly didn't know anything about that. I had been careful not to ask too many questions to avoid suspicion, and so far it was working. But I wasn't even close to knowing a damn thing that Osmond cared about. My calls to him were short and boring. While I didn't really have much of anything to report to Osmond, I certainly had a bunch of questions I wanted to ask him. The hardest part of all of this was trying to forget about my friends back in Beacon. I was starting to really regret not saying goodbye to my team, or RWBY. I didn't ask Osmond about how everyone was doing, no matter how much I wanted to. I didn't want him to think that I was having second thoughts, and it wasn't like any of my friends regularly spoke to the headmaster or anything. So I kept on with my job. It was the only thing I could think of doing, and it turned out I was on the right path already. One morning, after I had dropped off my final customer, I was making my way back to Aoshi's office to drop the cab off. A light turned red at an intersection, and I stopped to wait, grabbing my cup of lukewarm coffee and guzzling the contents. I didn't notice the three guys approaching my cab. A crowbar smashed my front windshield, making it spiderweb, as another guy dressed in a cheap leather jacket plunged a knife into my rear driver's side tire, deflating it. A third guy opened my door and pulled me out. Now I remember that Osmond never intended for me to get into fights, but I was working with a bunch of criminals and driving around a rough neighborhood, so I started keeping the tire iron for my cab in the front seat just in case things got ugly. As this big guy pulled me from my cab, I grabbed for the tire iron and swung it at him. He almost certainly wasn't expecting me to put up much of a fight, because my first swing struck him across the jaw. He let me go and fell to the sidewalk, drooling blood. What little time I had spent in Beacon learning to fight had always been against students who had their auras unlocked and a wealth of practice and experience. Seeing a guy bleeding on the sidewalk after just a single desperate swing was the last thing I expected. He didn't have any aura to shield him like everyone else I had fought before, and he wasn't even close to being as tough as the Grim. I was actually so stunned looking at this big guy spitting up his teeth that I didn't pay attention to the punk with the knife.
Fuck you!
He said, taking the cheap little blade and stabbing it right at me, only for my aura to flare up and shield me. Remembering that I was still in a fight, I turned and swung the tire iron at him as he tried for another stab. I smashed his wrist, and he dropped the knife with a string of curses. I probably broke his arm hitting him like that. This was a lot easier than Goodwitch's class, even if I was using an awkwardly balanced tire iron instead of a sword. The third punk who had been smashing my windshield and headlights finally decides to take a swing at me with his crowbar. It struck me right in my face and bounced right off my aura. It didn't so much as bruise me. I brought my tire iron down on his shoulder, and he screamed in pain as his arm dropped limp to his side. I heard his collarbone snap. That was all it took to send those punks running. They picked themselves up, and faster than they had appeared, scrambled down the alley. I chased after them a little, waving the tire iron over my head and screaming at them. "Yeah, you better fucking run!" I called after them, to make a point before stopping to watch them disappear. I caught sight of their jackets that all had some gold dragon embroidered on the back. I figured they were some street gang, but I was confused why a Mistrali gang in this neighborhood would try attacking one of Aoshi's cabs. That was the first time I had ever won a fight. I honestly felt like a bully kicking their asses. At Beacon, winning a fight meant I just knocked their aura down, and Goodwitch told us to stop. No one bled or lost teeth or needed a hospital. This was completely different to what I had spent so much time preparing for. The fights in Beacon were clean and bloodless. This wasn't like Beacon at all. I turned back to my cab to inspect the damage. 1 slashed tire, 1 broken windshield, 2 smashed headlights, and a huge collection of dents on the hood. To me, it looked like the only thing I prevented was 1 roughed-up driver, but I supposed for me that was good enough. I took the cab over to Tonan's shop, like Aoshi had told me to if there was any trouble. I pulled up and got a whole mess of looks. Tonan stepped away from one car he was working on to wipe his hand on a rag. "I need some repairs," I told him, feeling like that was the biggest understatement I could have made.
The fuck happened here?
He asked me, lighting a cigarette. "Some punks jumped me at a red light," I explained to him. "I managed to fight them off, but not before they trashed my ride." I told him everything about how they ambushed me while I was taking a drink of coffee, which I only then realized was all over my favorite Pumpkin Pete hoodie. I told him about how I managed to fight them with the tire iron, and about spotting the gold dragons on their jackets. He gave me a cigarette to smoke while he called Aoshi, and we took one of his cars to her office. She was already sitting behind her desk and enjoying a morning smoke when we arrived.
This kid says he was jumped by 3 dragons who trashed your cab,
he explained as I took a seat in front of her desk. Aoshi let out a curse and looked me over.
3?
She asked me, looking me up and down and seeing that I didn't even have a scratch on me. I nodded to her. "I chased them off with the tire iron," I explained to her. "Who are these dragons?" I asked her. "Why did they jump me?"
They're the 24K dragons.
She explained to me as I puffed on the cigarette Tonan had given me.
They used to work in the neighborhood with my blessing, until they started pushing drugs. Now they're making trouble for me. But how'd you fight them off?
With a tire iron, I explained to her.
Is that all?
She asked me. Well, they weren't exactly expecting me to have aura, I admitted. I didn't want to admit that, but I knew that if I looked like it was too easy, things were going to look suspicious to her.
You're packing aura?
She asked me.
Where'd a kid like you get that?
I didn't have an explanation lined up for her. It would have been better if she had no idea I had my aura unlocked. But I didn't, and I figured that the best lies are lined with truth. I was a Beacon student before I came here, I told her, hoping that I wouldn't immediately be run out by her for that little bit of truth. I was expelled.
Why?
She asked me. Because my transcripts were fake, I explained to her. I didn't have the training requirements, so once they found out, they gave me the boot. I sold my weapon for what money I could before looking for work.
So you're a washed-up academy kid.
She chuckled at that. Yeah, I admitted, scratching the back of my head and giving a glance to the rusty old hammer that was on her desk. I didn't mean to lie to you or anything. You just didn't ask.
Don't worry about it, kid.
She said, opening the drawer in her desk and reaching in.
It's not like you're the first Beacon washout to end up in the dumps.
She said, pulling a small leather holster from the drawer. From the holster, she drew a small snub-nosed revolver and popped the cylinder, checking that it was loaded before tucking it back in the holster and sliding it across the desk towards me.
I'm expecting the 24K dragons to be giving me more grief in the future. So having some of my drivers packing aura is just the kind of edge that I'm gonna need. Just make sure the next time you're jumped you wave this around instead of a tire iron. They'll be running for the hills.
She explained to me as I looked at the little handgun on the table. I stood up and snubbed out my cigarette in her ashtray before I picked it up. I drew it from the holster and looked at the polished blue steel. It was a simple .38, nothing compared to the massive sniper rifle scythe or shotgun gauntlets I had become accustomed to seeing in Beacon.
I know it's not much,
She said.
but it'll get the point across to those thugs.
I was honestly a little scared to accept that little pistol. I was more than a little scared, actually. I was supposed to be keeping my head down around these guys and reporting information. I wasn't supposed to be killing anyone for them. I already felt bad for busting those guys up. I imagined leaving them dead in the street, and I felt nauseous. But then again, earning trust wasn't easy, and I knew that if I said no, then my chances of getting deeper were going to evaporate. Thanks, I said, tucking the little pistol and holster away inside my waistband like it was designed to. I'll make sure those punks stay away from your cabs. She nodded to me.
Good. Now go and clean up, kid. Tonin and I need to discuss business.
She said, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. I left and walked back to my crummy apartment. I was constantly aware of the weight of the gun tucked into my jeans during the walk. I didn't exactly have a permit to carry a concealed weapon, but I suppose that meant little to Oushi. When I got back to my place, I locked the door and reheated some fried noodles Hannah had given to me. For all the issues my apartment had, her free home-cooked meals were certainly a good bonus. I set the gun down on my little coffee table and pulled out the burner scroll Osmond had given me.
Anything to report, Mr. Ark?
He asked the minute he picked up. I got jumped by some gang members this morning, I explained to him. They busted up Oushi's cab and tried to rough me up, but I managed to fight them off with little difficulty.
I see,
he said, probably wondering why I would think this is relevant to him. The gang is called the 24K Dragons. It seems they used to be on good terms with Oushi until they started dealing in drugs. I continued on for him. I had to explain to Oushi why I had aura, so I said that I was just some wash-up out of Beacon. She bought it. She says she's expecting more trouble in the future, and she gave me a gun just in case this ever happens again. She says she thinks she's gonna need more people like me with aura.
I understand,
Osmond said.
This is good, Mr. Ark. If she trusts you enough to help her with keeping her interests safe, it means you have a perfect opportunity to get closer to all of this. Continue to do what she asks of you. Be proactive in helping her take care of these dragons. She might trust you enough to get closer to her other business, maybe even to Junior himself.
Sir, she gave me a gun. Those guys I fought were big, but they didn't have aura. It was easy. What if she expects me to kill for her? I asked him, hoping that Headmaster Osmond, of all people, would have some kind of clever answer to my apprehension that would spare me from getting any blood on my hands.
Do whatever you must, Mr. Ark.
He told me.
Trust is not easy to earn.
The call ended, and all I could do was stare at the little .38. Small as it was, it felt quite heavy in my hands. Just real quick before the outro, I would like to thank that guy smoking a pipe for, first off, giving us mention in the first 2 chapters that we have read, and also for helping me with the designs and any other questions that I have on specific subjects throughout the story. And this has been Chapter 2, The First Time I Won a Fight, of A Man of Honor by that guy smoking a pipe. And thank you all so much for listening to a story.